These are the pieces to the winch from the Grizzly. I started to put the plastics back on the Grizzly and realized that I should see if I can get the winch to work, because when I received it, Quad had this winch on it and the winch was partially unspooled, and they had just wrapped the cable several times around the bumper in the front. So at some point the winch had quit working and they just abandoned it. I thought maybe they when they sunk it in the lake, they maybe had unspooled some of the cable to try and hook onto it and pull it out. Not sure. But what I determined was that when I hooked the battery up to the winch cables, nothing happened. It was just dead. So I immediately did some resistance checks and found out that I had an open reading right across the motor windings. Or I should say right across the two motor connections right here. I was getting a high resistance reading, and knowing that this thing had been in the water submerged, I decided I better take it apart and inspect it. Now, if you've ever taken one of these winches apart before, you'll know the critical mistake that I made next, which was, this is the end cap on the motor, and there were two bolts, bolt heads right here that I unscrewed. These two long bolts, when you remove them, allow this end cap to come off, and of course it springs off because there are 4 brushes that are spring loaded that sit in here that are pushing against the end of the, I believe this is called the stator, or no, the armature. Anyways, they're pushing up against this. This is all cleaned up now because this was all I had corrosion and gunk and crap in there, and I cleaned it all out. But anyways, that's what this pushes up against. The bolts are then, they go through this stator magnet assembly, and they go into these 2 holes on the winch. Problem was, after I cleaned everything up and went to put it all back together, I quickly realized, well, there was nothing for the bolts to thread back into, because what happens is, when you unbolt this, there are 2 captive nuts right here, these 2 little square suckers that actually sit in this little plastic square, 2 of them, and that's what this threads into. So what happens is, when you go to put the bolts back in, they just pop out and fall in. Now they're inside your winch. So at that point, you now have no choice but to completely disassemble the winch to get this out. So I had to do what I was trying to avoid in the first place, which is unbolt the winch from the machine and remove it completely. And once I did that, and I took the winch apart, which is just a matter of removing these Allen head screws that are located here, 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 here. There's 8 of them. I was glad I did it because I discovered a couple of things. First thing I discovered was that one of these screws was missing. And where the screw was missing was where this plate gets held onto the bottom. And so this plate had been allowed to move away, create a small space. And at some point, the cable had snagged in that spot. And when the cable got caught in there, they didn't realize it, I guess, and they kept trying to actuate it, and what ended up happening was they ground up this plastic. Now that's not really going to be a big deal, because when I put the replacement, this plate sits right in here like this. So when I put this plate back in and I screw it in, that cable's not going to be able to get behind there, and this chewed up plastic is just going to be a cosmetic thing, so it's no big deal. The second thing I found was that all of the grease that was inside here was heavily contaminated. Dirt, water, everything that you don't want in your grease was basically in this grease. So what I did was I soaked these parts in some parts cleaner, and I got most of the dirty grease out so I can re-grease everything. I also took all of these planetary gear assemblies and cleaned them up. Now I've got to reassemble all this, and everything is just kind of in a mess here. But I'm going to take you through reassembly of this thing so that if you happen to be in a situation where, like me, you took it apart and didn't really pay attention as to how it went all back together, I'm going to take you through it step by step. Or say maybe somebody gave you an old winch that they took apart and were playing with, and you wanted to fix it up, and you weren't quite sure how it all went back together because you didn't take it apart. Well, this will help you with that too. So this video is going to be just about the winch. Okay, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take inventory, make sure I have all my parts. I should have these two small square nuts that actually hold the motor to the housing. Two ends of the housing. One end has the lever on it that switches from free spool to engaged, and the other end is the side that these nuts go down into and the motor attaches to. The motor itself, which consists of the magnetic stationary part, I'm going to call that the stator, and the part with the copper windings on it, I'm going to call that the rotor. The base plate that this all mounts down to, and which also has the guide for the cable on it. 4 captive nuts that actually go in these end pieces right here, and that's what the bolts that go up through the bottom of the mounting plate on the ATV actually engage. 2 long bolts that go through the end cap of the motor, through slots in the stator, and engage the 2 square nuts. This flat disc, the actual spool itself with the cable on it, 2 end plates that have a plastic bushing inserted in them, 2 gears, one with a slot with flat sides to it that's taller, one that's smaller, this little triangle piece which also has this little metal insert in it that can be popped out, but I never took it out, so that is going to be in here, and with a little metal button facing in towards the mechanism. 3 planetary gear assemblies. These 2 little plate pieces should have 4 bolts this size. I left one out there on the ATV, but you have 4 bolts this size. They go up into these captive nuts through this plate and bolt the whole winch down to the mounting plate. 8 Allen head screws, 4 slightly longer than the other 4. I'm missing one, but I already discussed that that was missing, and I will get a replacement. And then the end cap assembly, which consists of the brushes and 4 springs, 1 under each brush. Oh, I missed one part on the parts list, which was this shaft right here with a spring on it. Now this winch wasn't working at all, and I suspect part of the problem was corrosion on this surface here that actually is what the brush is right up against. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assemble the motor to this side of the housing, because what that's going to allow me to do, since this side is actually supported, this side of the rotor is supported by a bearing or bushing in the end cap, and this other side of the rotor is actually supported by this bushing, which actually sits right in here on the end cap. By bolting this motor onto just this end cap, I can actually apply 12 volts with a battery to the motor and see if the motor is going to run. Because if the motor doesn't run, it doesn't make any sense for me to put the rest of this back together until I decide whether or not I want to even pursue repairing this winch. When reassembling this motor, it's much more manageable if you don't have to deal with these stiff copper cables being attached to it. So I'm disconnecting them from the end cap, from the connection points on the end cap. This one came off real easily because the boot had covered it up and it was well protected. This one, water had migrated in there and it was pretty corroded, so I had to put some penetrant on there and put it in the vise, and now I've got it where it's starting to work free. So I'm going to carefully keep working it and get this nut off without snapping the stud. When you're working on the end cap assembly, it's a good idea to remove these 4 springs under the brushes. That way you don't have to worry about one falling out inadvertently and being lost. Now I've got the 4 springs back in place, and then these brushes sit down inside these guides, and the idea is that they need to stay in this position as you lower this assembly down onto it. So now I'm going to show you a trick. Find yourself a scrap of thin gauge metal that's still pretty stiff, and this is a piece of tin, and I cut it with the tin snips, cut a little groove into it. The idea is that the groove should be deep enough into from the edge of the metal so that I can cover all 4 brushes, not entirely, just enough so I can push them all down, but should also be wide enough here so that this part right here can actually go right through it. Here you can see I'm holding down 2 of the brushes, and I can slide this across, and then I'll maneuver the other 2 brushes underneath. Now I'm compressing all 4 brushes in their compartments on top of the springs, and you can still see the hole that I need to stick the shaft of the stator in, or the rotor. I've now lowered the rotor onto the end cap, and now I just slide, while holding it down, I slide the metal piece out. Now, while holding the assembly together, I carefully rotate the end cap so that the screw holes line up with the slots that the long bolts have to go through. I'm now going to slide that bushing out of the end cover and place it correctly facing the other way on this shaft. Now I have the bushing on the shaft correctly. I can now turn the cover over and place the cover down on top. I now place the 2 captive square nuts down into their positions. I now have the nuts installed. I now carefully slide the edge of the motor, the end cap, off the edge of the bench, so I can now slide one of the long bolts up through the assembly. I very carefully ease it upwards and turn the housing so I can make sure the hole lines up, and when it starts to engage the nut, I can then tighten it. I then hand tighten it, and now I rotate the whole assembly on the bench so the other hole is now over the edge of the bench, and repeat. I now have tightened these 2 nuts, drawing the whole assembly together. I can now test by rotating the shaft. Now you're going to feel some drag. That's the brushes riding on the end part there. But now I can actually apply battery power to the 2 posts and see if the motor is good. I'm now going to test the unit. Now this motor will have a high starting torque. So if I would just connect it now, and if it were to start, it would probably want to spin that whole unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it down and keep 1 foot on it, and then touch my battery connections to the battery terminals here. Nothing. Dead. Alright, let's see what's going on. Okay, so I've gotten my multimeter. I'm going to put it on the resistance scale, and I'm going to check between the 2 posts to see what kind of a reading I get. Okay, I'm getting about 4 million ohms, so that's not good at all. So now I'm going to disassemble and see what I can find out. Okay, first obvious thing I want to check is I want to make sure I have continuity. This brush is common to this brush, so I want to make sure I have continuity between each one of these brushes and this post, and then the same thing on this side. Alright, check that. kind of deceiving, but this wire actually runs underneath here. This brush is common to this brush. That makes more sense. They're 180 degrees offset from each other. So the other pole is 90 degrees out of phase. So anyways, this one is common to this one, and this one's common to this one. So I check between this post and this one should all be common, and the same here. Okay, these two brushes have continuity to this connection, but these two brushes do not have continuity to this connection. And when I move the brush, I actually noticed that what has happened is this has actually separated, has broken off from that. And there's your problem right there. That's why this thing's dead. Okay, now I've removed these two screws that were right here, and that allows you to pull out this little like spider assembly. Gives you a little more room to see what's going on here. Spin it around. And what we've got is this is corroded and broken free. This looks like it may have been, not sure if that's copper or not. And this almost looks like a carbon steel. Okay, I tried unscrewing this nut right here to see if I could remove this from the assembly, and it started to turn and then it kind of seized up. It's really stuck on there. Before I go any further, I'm going to see what my options are. I would think these brushes are replaceable because they have a certain wear factor to them. Question is, can you get just the brush assemblies, or do you have to buy the whole end cap with the brushes internal to them? So I'm going to go on the Warn website and see what I can find out.